Hola, buenos días a todos. Mucho gusto, mi nombre es Juliana Bermeo. Yo soy la directora de posicionamiento global de FedeSoft y bueno, les quiero dar la bienvenida a este webinar de internacionalización. Vamos a hablar sobre innovación con el experto Charles Plant, quien ya muchos de ustedes conocen. Para los que no lo conocen, pues es un consultor que ha estado con nosotros trabajando ya, este será su tercer año. Entonces, pues siempre nos alegra mucho recibirlo. Antes de empezar, quisiera que por favor escribieran en la sección de preguntas si ustedes me están escuchando, hacer una pequeña prueba de sonido para saber que me escuchan bien antes de dar inicio. Entonces, también para que escriban ahí en la sección de preguntas y que sepan que al final del webinar, pues ahí también podrán depositar las preguntas que tengan para Charles. Perfecto, les agradezco mucho su respuesta. Listo, entonces como les contaba, hoy vamos a estar hablando sobre innovación. Les recuerdo que este webinar será en inglés. Y también recordarles que Charles va a estar acá la próxima semana haciendo unos talleres sobre estrategia empresarial. Para quienes estén ya inscritos, pues allá nos veremos. Y para quienes no hayan tenido la oportunidad de inscribirse, les cuento que estaremos el lunes en Bucaramanga, el martes en Medellín, miércoles en Cali, jueves Popayán y viernes Bogotá. Entonces, si no han tenido la oportunidad de inscribirse, me pueden escribir un correo y yo les envío el formulario y los datos para que nos acompañen. Mi correo para quienes no lo tienen es posicionamientoglobal@fedesoft.org. Y bueno, sin más preámbulos, quiero darle la bienvenida a Charles y bueno, espero que disfruten el webinar. And so, Charles, I think we're ready for you. I've done a brief sound check, and I think everyone can hear us. So
Perfect.
thank you for being here, and it's all yours.
Thank you very much. This today I wanted to talk about developing an innovative mindset, and it might seem a bit of a strange topic to be talking to people in a very innovative industry, in the software industry, about. But what I've found in dealing with many software companies is that while they're innovative, they they don't think about innovation in a structured manner. And developing an innovative mindset, I'm sort of trying to propose that there's a structured way that you can think about innovation, and you can design things with a systematic approach. So today I'm going to go through a couple of the systematic approaches to innovation, and in particular deal with design thinking, which is featured on this first slide. And so we'll go through the process of design thinking as an introduction to it, and it's something you might want to think of and look into further, and you can probably really benefit from something like a one-day workshop in design thinking as you're trying to develop a new idea. So if we start off with this developing an innovative mindset, the first issue is where ideas for businesses come from. And you're all sitting and you've all developed a business and have gotten your ideas from a variety of places. I've been working with all sorts of startups in the Toronto area, and I'm doing a study about where ideas come from to start their businesses. And it's an amazing set of coincidences and strange things that happen and all sorts of serendipity that creates an idea for a business. But the one thing I tend to be finding is that the businesses that are coming out of customers' ideas tend to develop faster and do better than businesses that come out of ideas that are just off the wall or something that someone thinks is a good idea. So as we go through this today, I'll probably mention a few different ones and where they're coming from. But meanwhile, let's look at Airbnb, which is an excellent example of a software company. I'm going to use two examples throughout this. The first is Airbnb, and the second is we're going to actually go through the process of designing a breakfast, because that's an easy one to do. So starting with Airbnb, and if I can find, let's get this going.
How Airbnb started. three guys went from renting air mattresses to a $10 billion company. Two guys in San Francisco couldn't pay rent. So they thought, why not rent out 3 air mattresses? They made a simple website, a blog with maps. 2 men and a woman showed up paying $80 each. After guests left, they thought, this could be a big idea. They invited a former roommate, Nathan, as a co-founder to build the site. Then they launched at South by Southwest and got 2 bookings. Brian, I hope it's not the only idea you're working on. So in 2008, they sold Obama O's cereal right before the election for $40 a box. They got their first money, $30,000. In 2009, they got $20,000 in first funding from Walgreens Y Combinator. They were making $200 a week for months, not growing much. Finally, they realized photos of places were not so pretty. So they went door to door in New York City and took photos by hand of listed houses. 1 week later, they were making $400 a week. Finally, they started growing. But they were still rejected by famous VC in New York City, Fred Wilson. Then Barry Manillo's drummer rented out an entire house. Aha, they thought. Then they raised $600,000 seed round from Sequoia Capital. In 2010, they raised $7.2 million. 2011, $112 million from many investors, including Ashton Kutcher, and finally, 2014, Airbnb is valued at $10 billion. Now, don't you tell me you can't do a startup.
So I like using Airbnb as an example of a startup because you'll notice there it took them quite some time to figure out what business they were in or how to do business. I mean, they started out with an idea that was right, but when they started it out, they didn't really understand the mind of the customer. And we'll go through that today as we look at how to use design thinking to understand the mind of the customer. But Airbnb could have easily failed if they'd never figured this out. And if they'd started off with a better approach to innovation, with a more innovative mindset, they might have been developed sooner, although you can't fault them for having done what they've done because they've created an incredible company out of this. So, the places that ideas come from, they come from partly from your own problems, and this was a really interesting one because it wasn't people traveling. Airbnb said, I want to go to a new city to a conference, but I can't afford a hotel. The problem was I've got some spare space and I need to make some money. So the perspective that the people who started Airbnb had was not on the customer. Their perspective was on the problem of the person who had the room. And I think that's what influenced some of their original thinking and why it took them a little while to start off, because they were perceiving something from their own lens and not from the lens of the consumer. So you can start something off with your own problem. And then, there are a lot of people who have things that are called eureka moments. And a eureka moment is this all of a sudden idea that comes to you. And, it's said that Isaac Newton figured out gravity when an apple fell from a tree, but actually he'd been working on this problem for quite a long time. And similarly, in the Airbnb case, their eureka moment came from a whole bunch of conversations and issues that they were having at a point in time, and they started to associate one thing with another. And we'll see a video in a second about that eureka moment and coming up with ideas. So there was partly their own problem, partly a eureka moment. Then they're also influenced phenomenally by technological development, because if Airbnb tried to start 10 years before, they wouldn't have succeeded. There were certain capabilities that had to be in place before Airbnb could be successful. First of all, we had to have the internet in place. We had to have people using the World Wide Web. We had to have computers that were fast enough to download pictures and internet streaming that was fast enough to render up those pictures. So in a lot of things, they were they came to the advantage of a technological development, and they were also along a certain trend line that said, this thing is now possible. Another way that these ideas can come out is through competitive products. And if you've ever tried to go to a city and stay at a bed and breakfast, you'll know that there are an incredible number of bed and breakfasts that exist and that have existed on websites long before Airbnb got going on an effective way. Airbnb just did a good job of it, and instead of individuals organizing themselves one by one, they managed to figure out a platform for everybody to benefit from this. So some influence from competitive products in their design and implementation as a way they came up with the idea. Now, some things come up with combined ideas, and this wasn't the case here, and I'm not sure that combined ideas always work out well. We've got things like the toaster that makes your coffee in the morning as an idea that people come up with, but Airbnb wasn't one of those cases. What they did benefit from is this trend, and many ideas come out of trends that are occurring in the marketplace, and a whole bunch of people have started started businesses based on the trend towards a sharing economy. And the sharing economy is something interesting because before it started, people were of the belief that there wouldn't be people wouldn't trust other people in their house, or they wouldn't trust them with their car or their bicycle or looking after their dog. But the trend has been towards a sharing economy, and when that trend started, people started looking for opportunities to build companies around this trend of sharing. So you get all sorts of different companies that have come out with them. One Airbnb, a lot of car sharing companies. One of my favorites is Doggy Vacay, which is the chance to you take your dog to someone when you're going on vacation. And in Toronto here, they actually share driveways for parking. So that's a small application that I know that has been experimented with here. So there are a lot of trends that people look at a trend and say, okay, how can I extend that trend to one more thing? Another way of coming up with ideas is understanding customers and their unmet needs. And to me, this is one of the very best ways of finding problems and coming up with innovative ideas, is finding things that are out there that are underlying unmet needs, and in particular, other people's problems. And this is what's interesting about the research that I'm doing right now, is where people are coming up with ideas that are based on other people's problems. They're doing much, much better than companies that are coming up with ideas on their own. And I've got one company I'm dealing with that has developed an echolocation device to assist blind people in navigating through complex environments. Because if you can think about it, people have been using a cane or a guide dog for many, many years in order to navigate the world. Blind people have. And yet we've got self-driving cars. So how can we have these autonomous self-driving cars and yet blind people are still using a cane? So this company I'm working with has developed a device that allows people to, it echolocates walls and obstructions that they wouldn't find with a cane, and allows them to be able to operate without a cane in many environments. And they're extending that out. But they got that idea because one of their families had been heavily involved with an orphanage, a blind orphanage in India for many years, and they were fully understanding of the problems that blind people had, particularly in third world countries. Another company I'm dealing with has developed a system for detecting UV and being able to understand how much they can be out in the sun without getting a burn, and it links to your iPhone or your Android device, etc. Now they came up with that idea after about 7 other ideas, and what they were trying to do was not originally associated with this particular idea. And I'm waiting to see how well it develops, because they didn't come up with a customer's problem. They were coming up with an abstract problem that they thought people might have. It wasn't even their own problem, so we'll see how that one does. Now, Airbnb is a perfect example, though, of solving other people's problems. So let's look at Stephen Johnson for a second.
For the past 5 years, I've been investigating this question of where good ideas come from. It's a kind of problem I think all of us are intrinsically interested in. We want to be more creative. We want to come up with better ideas. We want our organizations to be more innovative. I've looked at this problem from an environmental perspective. What are the spaces that have historically led to unusual rates of creativity and innovation? And what I found in all of these systems, there are these recurring patterns that you see again and again that are crucial to creating environments that are unusually innovative. One pattern I call the slow hunch, that breakthrough ideas almost never come in a moment of great insight, in a sudden stroke of inspiration. Most important ideas take a long time to evolve, and they spend a long time dormant in the background. It isn't until the idea has had 2 or 3 years, sometimes 10 or 20 years to mature, that it suddenly becomes accessible to you and useful to you in a certain way. And this is partially because good ideas normally come from the collision between smaller hunches so that they form something bigger than themselves. So you see a lot in the history of innovation, cases of someone who has half of an idea. There's a great story about the invention of the World Wide Web in Tim Berners-Lee. This is a project that Berners-Lee worked on for 10 years. But when he started, he didn't have a full vision for this new medium he was going to invent. He started working on one project as a side project to help him organize his own data. He scrapped that after a couple of years, and he started working on another thing. And only after about 10 years did the full vision of the World Wide Web come into being. That is, more often than not, how ideas happen. They need time to incubate, and they spend a lot of time in this partial hunch form. The other thing that's important when you think about ideas this way is that when ideas take form in this hunch state, they need to collide with other hunches. Oftentimes, the thing that turns a hunch into a real breakthrough is another hunch that's lurking in somebody else's mind. And you have to figure out a way to create systems that allow those hunches to come together and turn into something bigger than the sum of their parts. That's why, for instance, the coffee house in the Age of the Enlightenment or the Parisian salons of modernism were such engines of creativity because they created a space where ideas could mingle and swap and create new forms. When you look at the problem of innovation from this perspective, it sheds a lot of important light on the debate we've been having recently about what the internet is doing to our brains. Are we getting overwhelmed with an always connected, multitasking lifestyle? And is that going to lead to less sophisticated thoughts as we move away from the slower, deeper, contemplative state of reading, for instance? Obviously, I'm a big fan of reading, but I think it's important to remember that the great driver of scientific innovation and technological innovation has been the historic increase in connectivity and our ability to reach out and exchange ideas with other people and to borrow other people's hunches and combine them with our hunches and turn them into something new. That really has, I think, been, more than anything else, the primary engine of creativity and innovation over the last 600 or 700 years. And so, yes, it's true we're more distracted. But what has happened that is really miraculous and marvelous over the last 15 years is that we have so many new ways to connect and so many new ways to reach out and find other people who have that missing piece that will complete the idea we're working on, or to stumble serendipitously across some amazing new piece of information that we can use to build and improve our own ideas. That's the real lesson of where good ideas come from, that chance favors the connected mind.
I really like that last expression, chance favors the connected mind, because as you'll notice, and particularly from Airbnb, it's the connection of all sorts of disparate things that came together in a certain place to be able to create this innovative idea for a company. So what I want to do is take you through a couple of different ways or structured manners of thinking about ideas before we go on to design thinking, because there are all sorts of different ways of thinking that have come out in the marketplace. The first one of these that I'll deal with is integrative thinking. And integrative thinking came out of a man by the name of Roger Martin, who was the last dean of the Rotman Business School at the University of Toronto. And he defines the integrative thinking as the ability to constructively face the tensions of opposing models instead of choosing one at the expense of the other, generating a creative resolution of the tension in the form of a new model that contains elements of the individual models, but superior to each. So, an integrative thinker, or let's start with a non-integrative thinker. A non-integrative thinker is thinking really inside the box. They're selecting only certain parts of the issue to be considered in coming up with a solution. They consider only the causal relationships between things they think are important. They solve problems in steps without thinking the big picture, and they consider the resolution as only the end product. And a great example of this, before we get into integrative thinking, is an apartment building in New York City in the 1920s, I think it was. And it was a very expensive apartment building, and the residents were complaining about how slow the elevators were. And so the building engineers and management and the representatives from the tenants got together to figure out how to deal with this problem of slow elevators in the building. And so they went through all the traditional non-integrative methods of thinking, saying, okay, what if we speed up the elevators? What if we put in another bank of elevators? What if we stopped on we had to double up elevators so one serves one floor and one serves the other floor, all sorts of technical issues and ideas that were incredibly expensive until finally someone came up with what is best described as integrative thinking and said, okay, well, the issue is probably what people are doing while they're waiting, so why don't we put mirrors up outside the elevators so that when people are waiting for the elevators, they're staring at themselves, which everyone likes to do, and therefore they're not going to notice how long it takes for an elevator to come. So that's really the integrative thinking in a nutshell. People are searching for creative solutions to the aspects of the issue at hand, not just solving individual parts of the problem. They're seeing the big picture while they're working on the individual parts, and the big picture is an individual and what their behavior was in that case. And they're realizing that there's causal relationships are more than just one way, but they can see problems from multiple viewpoints and take them all into consideration. And I think the biggest thing there is seeing it from the viewpoint of the user of the elevator. And if you go back to Airbnb, this is really critical for Airbnb as well, because they were looking at things from the perspective of the renter, or the person who had the place that wanted to rent, and they weren't seeing things from the perspective of the user. But when you get down and look at the user's perspective, they're about to take a risk. They're going on a vacation, which is a highly emotional thing. They want to have a good experience, and they're taking a risk about where they're staying. Now, you could stay at a chain hotel, and you know exactly what you're going to get. But if you start to stay at a bed and breakfast, you don't know what you're going to get. So if there are bad pictures there, you're not going to feel entirely comfortable about staying there. So the underlying emotion that people were dealing with was risk. And when they recognized that they had to resolve this problem of risk because they took into point the viewpoint of the user, they were able to go and take pictures of the places and thereby increase enrollment tremendously. And even nowadays, if you look at the statistics, you'll find that there's a phenomenal increased rentability in places that have pictures, good pictures taken professionally versus places that don't. So that's integrative thinking. There's another approach which is systems thinking. And you look at systems thinking from two perspectives. And one is event-oriented thinking, and this is thinking in straight lines. Systems thinking tends to think in a loop structure. And in systems thinking, a behavior emerges from the structure of feedback loops. So if you're looking at Airbnb, if you thought about someone's action and looked at only in a straight line, you would have seen people going onto the website, looking at places, clicking between a number of different places, being dissatisfied and leaving. But what they're not going through is what's going through in the person's mind and why they're doing the behavior that they're doing and what's underlying it. So critical thinking is another approach to this, and it goes through by recognizing assumptions, evaluating arguments, and drawing conclusions. So the first assumption that could have been made in the Airbnb case is that people only need to know what the prices are and what the locations are. And so you would go and try and test that assumption and evaluate those arguments and then come up with all sorts of different things that could be assumptions, like maybe we're assuming that people don't need to see something that's to see details about what the place looks like or its location or something like that. And so you go through a pattern of critical thinking. Now, the most developed way of doing this and thinking in an innovative manner is design thinking. And design thinking has come out of Stanford, and I'll just show you a little video to start the process. Hold on a second.
Hi there. Have you noticed that the world is full of problems? There are big, hairy problems, like poverty and disease, and small annoyances like misplacing your keys. However, the geniuses at Stanford have come up with a process that will broaden your perspective and help you create better solutions, no matter the type of problem. This process is called design thinking, and it's here to change the way you tackle problems. Design thinking encourages people to explore new alternatives, creating options that had not existed before. Design thinking is successful because it focuses on the needs of the user. It's more than just good ergonomics. It's about understanding the context and culture of the stakeholders involved. This understanding is found using direct observation and qualitative data, which produces stories that people can really empathize with. Once the research is conducted, the problem solver is more apt to define what the real problem is. After diagnosing the true problem, it's time to ideate or brainstorm new ideas without the constraints of existing solutions. Because design thinkers learn by doing, these radical ideas are then made into simple prototypes that test possible outcomes. Rapid prototyping speeds up the innovation process because we only learn about the quality of our ideas when we test them in the real world. The process of ideating, prototyping, and testing is repeated early on so that mistakes are quick, cheap, and ultimately lead to success. So, why design thinking? The process provides a method and a unifying language for multidisciplinary collaboration, leading to greater creativity and better solutions faster. Suddenly, the world's problems are simple and manageable with design thinking.
So what you saw there is just an outline, and basically there are 5 phases that we're going to go through in design thinking as in a structured approach, and really highly structured approach to coming up with innovative ideas. So you start with empathizing with your end user, defining the problem, coming up with ideas that might solve the problem, prototyping those ideas, and finally testing. So if you're believe in the lean startup methodology and all lean programming, things like that, some of this is aligned with that lean startup and lean methodology. But the idea is to go through this process before you actually go and create a product, because you'll get more understanding of your customers if you do. And you'll notice that Airbnb didn't do that. They didn't go through and understand their end users very well before they started and built a product. And if they'd done that and if they followed this process, they might have had better results or quicker results. Once again, can't fault them on better results. So the first of the steps in design thinking is to empathize. And I have real fun in trying to deal with this issue of empathy, because I'm frequently dealing with engineers and computer scientists, as many of you probably are, and trying to help people understand what empathy is and what you need to do to be able to empathize is really quite interesting. So empathy is the foundation, really, of human-centered design process. You need to both observe and you look at the users and their behavior in the context of their lives. What are they doing in their lives and why are they behaving that way? So observing. You also have to engage and interact with and interview users through scheduled and short encounters. And you have to immerse yourself in what their experience is and understand the user experience and what they're going through, not from a technical or procedural basis, but what they're feeling at the time they're doing things. And this all comes down to a lot of work that's being done in the world of behavioral economics to understand how people behave when they're making purchase decisions. Because people make decisions more from emotions than they do from facts. And when you try and seek to empathize with people, what you're trying to do is understand those emotions and put themselves put yourself in their place. And what you want to ask when you're doing this is you can understand and most people understand what they do as a business. And many companies understand how they do it, but very few really understand the underlying motivation and why they're doing things. So understanding why people are doing things is really critically important. If you look at Airbnb, they understand what they were doing. They were linking up people who had apartments for rent or spaces for rent and people who needed them. They understood how they did that. They did that through a website that allowed you to put in characteristics and do matching, etc. But they didn't understand why people were behaving the way they were doing until they finally realized that they needed to reduce the risk, and people were evaluating places on an emotional basis, not on a logical basis. And that enabled them to move forward quite effectively. So some of the ways that you would actually go through and understand and empathize with people is you could undertake a camera study. You want to understand users' lives and specific tasks in the context of their lives. So a camera study allows you to experience the user's viewpoint by seeing it through their eyes. So you might actually get the user to take a camera and use a camera in their daily life and go through the process that they go through and highlight what is important to them through the camera. Because what you see is what's important. It may not be what the user sees, and the camera study allows you to get it that way. So you give them instructions such as, we want to understand what a day in your life feels like, or take the camera with you wherever you go and take pictures of experiences that are important to you. And when you're dealing with that importance, you're understanding what's important to them, so you put yourself into the mind of the user. And afterwards, you get your subjects to walk through the pictures and explain the significance of what they're doing and why they're doing it. Another thing you can do is interview people, and that's a classic technique. Understand what they're doing and why they're doing it, but most of all, you want to understand for empathy. You want to get to underlying causes of their behavior, what they're feeling when they're doing something, in order to understand the relationship that you have with the product. Another technique is to look for extreme users. And extreme users are people that are very heavy users, so for instance, if you're dealing with Airbnb, you might say people who travel a lot are extreme users, or people who travel a lot in bed and breakfast, people who do not stay in hotels, are really extreme users. And understanding those extreme users gives you a really great ability to understand what some of the other users might want at the same time. So what I want to do very quickly is just think about what you have to do to redesign the experience of making breakfast. And hopefully you can use the chat feature. Just tell me in 1 or 2 words what the emotion you had today making breakfast. Is it possible to use the chat? Maybe, Juliana, you could experiment with that. Just tell me any quick emotion that you had making breakfast. I'm not seeing anything there. How about using questions as a way of doing it? Anyone? Well, if not, I can move on to something else. But we might be able to come back to that at some point in time. I thought I'd experiment with this. So let's say you've gone through and you've gotten, and I did this with a group recently on the experience of making breakfast, and they came up with things like they were feeling guilty because they weren't eating the right thing. They were feeling rushed because they didn't have enough time. Some of them were feeling highly satisfied. Some of them were enjoying the taste. Some of them enjoyed the experience. Some of them disliked the experience. But what you do is you collect all of those experiences around making breakfast or Airbnb, etc., and you sit down and you have to try and define what the problem is. And so your objective in this second phase is define what the challenges people have, what the goals and what the opportunities have. And this is when you're unpacking and synthesizing all of the definitions of empathy that came out in your testing of people, in your camera studies, your interviews, and anything like that. And you should be doing things from a point of view of the end user, defining what their goals are, what their opportunities are, and what their problems are. When you've done that, you simply put these onto yellow stickies and start to tell stories about the end user. So-and-so had a problem with breakfast because she woke up too late and didn't have time to make anything healthy, so just grabbed a coffee and a muffin at a store. And this becomes a story that you can put up on a board and capture all sorts of information relevant to people making their decision. The next thing you want to do is you want to actually go through and look at these in relationships to one another. So you might have a group of people who really enjoy making breakfast, and you put all their stories together. You might have another group of people who are really challenged for time, and their stories go together. Another group that don't know how to cook, or another group that doesn't understand nutrition. And what you're doing in this process is you're grouping sets of feelings together in a way that you can later understand what potential market segments exist if you want to understand the process or do a better job at making breakfast. What you do when you've done that is you then create what is known as an empathy map. And this is unpacking 4 quadrants to understand the relationship that what people say and what they do is different than what they think and they feel. So you want to understand what they're saying at one point in time, what they're doing versus what they're thinking and feeling. And getting this, you want to, in the say section, say, what are some of the quotes and defining words that the user used? In the doing section, what actions or behaviors did you notice from the camera studies or observing people? In terms of thinking, what might your user be thinking? What does this tell you about their beliefs? And in feeling, what emotions might they be feeling? And your thoughts and beliefs and feelings and emotions can't be observed directly. So you can observe the saying and doing, but you can't observe the thinking and feeling. This is where you need to get in depth with your user. And through this process, you're trying to identify needs, which are human emotional or physical necessities, and insights, which is a realization that you could leverage to get somewhere in designing a solution to their problem. You might also produce a journey map. And this is something I've used for many, many years, and it's probably the one technique that has served me the best in designing products, is understanding the journey of the user from the beginning to the very end, and actually mapping that out. For those of you who have been around for a while, you might have actually used drawing templates and drawing and things like that to draw the user out. Now you can do that very easily in a computer basis. But understanding each of the various steps that a user goes through to be able to solve a problem that they're having is critical in understanding where the gaps might be and where they've got feelings that might be an opportunity to capitalize on for the creation of new products. And then from those, what you want to do is you want to organize the data in a way that sort of makes a timeline of events, a number of parallel timelines that allows for easy comparison. So if you remember in the last one, in making breakfast, we had users that are rushed for time and users that knew how to cook and users that wanted a nutritious meal. They each might have a separate journey map, and understanding what the journey map is of each one of them might get to underlying issues when you're trying to define the problem. So when you do this, you catalog needs and insights that people have. So you develop some set of needs and understanding of the need for nutrition, the need for time, the need for taste, and all of the various things that might form a basis of needs that people might have. And from that, you develop something like a problem statement. And the idea of the problem statement is a way of expressing the user's individual problem. And in this case, you might have 4 or 5 different users, and you might give them a name. So-and-so needs a nutritious breakfast because she's an athlete and needs to work out at 10 o'clock every morning. And so your insight is this insight which is the underlying cause of the need that is there in the marketplace. So you've gone through the definition phase, and the next phase is you want to go through an ideation phase. Many people skip straight to coming up with ideas without going through the empathizing phase and defining stage. And this is where problems start to come and why so many products end up failing in the marketplace, is that ideation is something that is the middle of a process, not the beginning of coming up with things. And so it's the mode where you're trying to generate radical design alternatives. And you're going really wide and really large and not being incremental in your approach, but doing something entirely phantasmagorical to see if there's a possibility of coming up with a solution that is really out of the box. And so what you want here is to large quantity of ideas and a large amount of diversity between those ideas. One of the ways of doing that is to use what's called powers of 10. And powers of 10 is, so you've come up, understand the user, you've defined the problem, and you say during a brainstorming session, what if it had to cost less than 10 cents to provide breakfast? Or what if it was took less than 10 seconds to make? Or something that is 10 times the normal price now, and trying to imagine how that might occur. And all sorts of software companies that have done this very successfully and created products that, using this whole concept of powers of 10, and radically reduced the complexity of their software or the price of their software or the amount of time to install the software, and as a result have found an entirely new market just by challenging themselves with this power of 10. Another process is to use a 2x2 matrix, and the 2x2 matrix is in the design. So you pick something and say, okay, let's look at the two extremes in each case of food. It's either junk food or nutritious, or it's fast or it's slow. And in terms of junk food, we've got an Eggo waffles category, and pancakes is slow junk food, bacon and eggs is slow nutritious, and cereal is fast nutritious. And that way you can start grouping your subjects and your users and the problems they have into these groups, looking for solutions in a particular area in your 2x2 matrix. Another way of doing it is to express in a point of view. And that point of view for food might be saying, a teenage girl needs more nutritious food because vitamins are vital to good health. But an alternate point of view would be to say that a teenage girl with a bleak outlook needs to feel more socially accepted when eating healthy food, because in her neighborhood, social risk is more dangerous than a health risk. And this point of view is, you can come up with a number of different options for a point of view, and it's a way of expressing, again, and defining a need. You might also ask questions like, how might we? So how might we make it very simple for people to cook breakfast? How might we make it extremely fast? How might we make breakfast more nutritious than it currently is? So these questions enable you to come up with answers in a structured way that random ideation doesn't work for. Next is coming up with brainstorming. And brainstorming is a great way, and this is what a lot of companies go right to when they want to come up with ideas. They skip these structured approaches like powers of 10 and the 2x2 matrix, and they go straight towards brainstorming. And you get people in a brainstorming mode, and you get them to sit down in front of a whiteboard and take an active role in just writing up all the potential ideas that come from one another at one time. More in a structured way is to impose constraints. So, it might be a bit counterintuitive, but this is quite like coming up with powers of 10, thinking of it in impose constraints. And what if it could only have 100 calories as a constraint that you might have? Or what if it had to be cooked in 1 minute? Or what if it had to cost less than $1? So a similar way to powers of 10 imposing constraints on the other side allows you to come up with all sorts of different ways of looking at a problem. And based upon this, you go through and you've ideated. You've come up with an idea for solving an expressed need for a person's breakfast. And in the same way that the people at Airbnb came up with an idea and that they had to improve upon that idea, and their idea was taking pictures of locations in order to make it more risk-free for the consumer who's actually making the purchase. So that's the end of the third phase. The fourth phase is a prototyping phase. This is where a lot of software companies have difficulty because they come up with an idea and they go into that idea and they create their software without going back and looking at the user and defining the problem and going through and empathizing with the user. And I had some really interesting example recently. There's an organization called AngelList, which is used by people in the technology field, and it's a way of group people, technology in the field can interact, find jobs, hire people, and can raise money in the United States. And AngelList was recently approved in Toronto for making money. And the people at the Ontario Securities Commission commented that they had had numerous applications from people who had completed software without bothering to find out what they, the Ontario Securities Commission, felt were the things that they had to do and what the regulations were, etc. So people in the fintech world were jumping straight to solving a problem instead of actually going through a defined process and then coming up with a prototype, because a prototype is a lot less expensive than going through to your final solution. And if you're in a physical object, you can actually come up and prototype using 3D printers and things like that. If you're dealing with software, you can prototype by mocking up screens and allowing people to interact with the mocked up screens in a way that allows you to see what their reaction is to the solution that you've mocked up here. In it, what you want to do, though, is you want to prototype for empathy, because you want to understand how a person is feeling when they're using something. And this is an example of people have standing desks and walking desks, and they're now trying out something stupid called riding desks. But you want to test this prototype with the users to gain understanding and empathy with the position that they're in. You want to prototype to test how different iterations of this, and you go through the prototyping so that you can do tests on a very quick basis. Because you can quickly make one prototype, and if that doesn't work, you come along with another prototype, and you go iteratively through the creation of these prototypes, all for the purpose of testing it with an end user. And in testing it with an end user, it's the chance to get feedback on your solutions. And it again, too, is an iterative mode, and you might even go back as you're doing this and go back through the whole design process, go back through looking for empathy and defining their process again, coming up with new ideas and coming up with new prototypes on a continued revolutionary basis in order to come up with some innovative solution. And of course, you want to do your testing with users. Most important of all of this is understanding the user and understanding their basis of experience. This is where a lot of companies get divorced from reality because they're divorced from their end user. And as we've gone through all of these, what we're trying to emphasize is how you get yourselves in a structured manner into the mind of your user as you're going through and trying to come up with an innovative new idea. And not just relying on your own experiences, your own perception of the world, but going through and understanding a user's perspective, being able to define what that perspective is, come up with ideas around their perspective, build a prototype, and then test it with your end users to completely get their perspective. So developing an innovative mindset, just as a summary, it's thinking about problems in a structured way, not in an unstructured way. And whether you use integrative thinking or systems thinking or some form of design thinking, any of that is a useful, structured way to approach problems so that then you can make sure that you've covered all bases. The second key is really focusing in on the user of this, not the developer. And many people forget that there are all sorts of nuances to users that you can't understand unless you actually focus in on that user. And when you focus in on the user, the thing you want to do is have empathy for what the user is going through in order to understand and define their problem. And finally, challenge the status quo when you intend to ideate. Try and go to extremes using extreme users, powers of 10, imposing constraints, all as a technique in a structured manner to come up with different solutions. So that's what I want you to take away as a brief exposure to design thinking and something you might want to explore another day in more detail. But now I thought it might be useful in the last 5 minutes to see if there are any questions that people have that they might want to ask that we could answer today. Any questions? Juliana, any questions?
At the moment, nobody has written anything. So Augusto says, I think it was a great review.
Yeah, he also mentioned, I missed seeing that because my screen wasn't large enough. He felt stressed making breakfast. I'm sorry we stressed you out with breakfast. No worries, okay. We'll give you more time for breakfast next time. Has anybody tried design thinking? Is there anybody that had used it or been exposed to it before? I don't know if you can see that, Juliana. I'm having trouble translating the Heidi's question.
Yeah, but I'm not sure it's related to the webinar. She says she's interested in, they have a IT program for youngsters, and they have a project and they want to push that project, and they want to see if there are any financing sources for this type of projects, but not sure it's related to our talk today.
No, not much I can do about that today, but we could discuss it when I'm down in Columbia next week. Okay, a book that describes design thinking in a deeper way. First of all, there's all sorts of examples on the net, on videos on design thinking, and I'm just looking at my bookshelves right now because I can find a book that, because I've got several of them on design thinking, but give me half a second here and I know where I can find it. So one by Tim Brown is a book called Change by Design, How Design Thinking Transforms Organizations and Inspires Innovation. So it was produced in September 2009, and Tim Brown. Augusto is still trying to deal with empathy. There's also Stanford Design Thinking. There are a number of things on YouTube. And there's a TED Talk by Tim Brown. And there's Google for Entrepreneurs, Lean Startup Meets Design Thinking. What I'll do is I'll send Juliana a list of these YouTube and book resources that you might be able to see?
Yeah, of course, I can share it with everyone.
Any other questions?
Augusto is asking if we can share the PowerPoint slides. Yes, of course, we can share them. Like the PowerPoint slides, the recording of this webinar will be also available on our website, as well as all the other webinars we've done. So you can all check them out there. Okay, I don't think there are any more questions.
Okay, I've just sent Juliana an email with the videos and books in it.
Perfect. I will make sure to share it with everyone else. Thank you.
Great.
Okay, I think it's safe to say that we are done with it, with the webinar. Charles, thank you so much, as always, for your time and your sharing all your knowledge. We very much appreciate it. And then we will see you next week.
Excellent. Look forward to it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.